Thank you so much, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm thrilled to be part of this. Just a very quick intro from me before we get cracking. It doesn't need much of an introduction on why this is important, but obviously humanitarian needs, unfortunately, continue to rise across the world, primarily due to conflict, but also compound risks of climate and the legacy of COVID, and certainly recent tragic events in Syria and Turkey are on front of our mind, and we watch with concern as Cyclone Freddy moves towards Mozambique and Madagascar. But the UN estimates 339 people will require humanitarian assistance this year. Famine, something that we thought was relegated to history, is at greater risk than ever. 45 million people at risk of starvation. And our ability to meet these needs is constrained. The UN and partners are seeking over 50 billion this year. And the gap between needs and our resources to respond just gets greater. So against this backdrop, it's essential that we are evidence-based in our decision-making to make the most of every single dollar spent in terms of maximizing its positive impact in terms of meeting, reducing or preventing needs. So no secret, the CEDIL is a bit of a smaller donor than it used to be in ODA terms, and something that's been difficult for some of our partners, we recognise. But we still have an ambitious programme of work in this area in terms of evaluation, impact evaluation research, that aims to be support to the wider system. So some of the examples, you've got the CEDIL work, we've got some work with the World Bank, UNHCR on forced displacement, with JPAL on protection of civilians in conflict, with IPA, with ELRA, just to name a few. So we see this as a really critical area. And perhaps we'll come back to the end at the end of the session a bit more on where it's heading. But by their very nature, some of the places where we have the most severe needs and spend a great deal of money are also those where it's most difficult to build evidence and do research and impact evaluations. But it is possible, and there are examples of increasingly strong partnerships between academic evaluation and operational actors that we're here today. And that's why I'm so pleased to be here and learn from the exciting, innovative approaches that some of our speakers will be able to reflect on today. We have 4 expert presentations. Each will be about 8 minutes. The speakers will present their work and their key insights and reflections, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So please do put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll come straight to you after the presentations. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over first to Jeannie Annan, who's Chief Research and Innovation Officer at the International Rescue Committee. Over to you, Jeannie.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Really nice to be here, and good afternoon, good morning to all. I will, as I'm pulling up my screen, I wanted to start actually with the good news, I think, on where we are on this topic, which is really that the number of impact evaluations in humanitarian settings, despite the challenges, as Chris has mentioned, has really grown over the last number of years. And so we do know a lot more than we did a number of years ago. And there are many more actors who are doing impact evaluations in humanitarian settings. The less good news is that the number of impact evaluations in humanitarian settings is still a very small number compared to those in more stable settings in low and middle income countries. So this is now a few years old, but this is from 3IE data from around 2019, just looking at the number of impact evaluations in low and middle income countries in the over 4,000, and the number of those that were in humanitarian settings more in the 250 range. So I'm sure both of these have now grown, and hopefully significantly. This hasn't been updated, but there's a real imbalance, and so the need to increase the impact evaluations, understanding what works in these settings, is incredibly important. I was going to make the point that Chris just made very well, so I won't go into this, but the need has grown in humanitarian settings. Unfortunately, we only see that continuing to grow, and the funding, again, as Chris said, is not only not growing along with it to bridge that gap, but in some cases is shrinking. So it's really making this imperative to understand what works for whom under what conditions, so that then we can decide what to stop, what to continue, what we need to improve. And that's really why IRC, as an implementing organization, has invested in doing impact evaluations. So we've now completed over 50 impact evaluations over the number of years, and have about 20 ongoing or just starting, just to give you a sense of the breadth, and that's across our different outcome areas at a high level, which are safety, health, education, economic well-being, and power. So I thought I wanted to make 3 broad points, not diving. I'll give one example of an evaluation that's ongoing, but wanted to make points that we've learned over the years of doing these 70 plus impact evaluations, both in terms of the sort of doing the actual evaluation, but really importantly, then being able to learn from the evaluation as an implementing organization and share that learning with the broader field. So one is to ask the most important questions. That might be obvious, but really, what are the critical questions that we need to learn, and really include impact evaluations and impact questions as part of a broader learning agenda. Understanding the impact is really critical, but there are many other questions along with impact that practitioners and policymakers want to know in order to make decisions, evidence-based decisions. And so we really see impact evaluations as part of a learning agenda, and I'll share a little bit more about that. The second is be flexible about the right methods for the question and the situation, with ethics really at the fore for that. And this is for all of that learning agenda, but certainly for impact evaluations. The third is to do impact evaluations at the right time. So iterate, learn, improve continually, and certainly before investing in an impact evaluation. That's not a small investment, as any of you who have either been part of the program or part of the evaluation team know. And so I can share some of how we're thinking about that. So on the first, ask the most important questions, and impact evaluations being part of a research and learning agenda, we really see a range of different questions being critical for our decision-making, and impact evaluations being part of that. So this includes understanding the issue or the problem, so the prevalence, the drivers, the consequences, and of the outcome of interest, operational and design research, and so really understanding in early stages what will potentially improve the effectiveness, how to adapt operationally, and design research that feeds right into adaptation. Then impact and effectiveness research, both on the actual outcomes of interest and the cost, and then implementation research, and thinking here more about questions at scale to optimize the intervention, and again emphasizing costing here, which often it isn't always included in impact evaluations, and yet is critical to decision making. So here's one example. We have these learning agendas across all of IRC's outcome areas. I thought I would just highlight one, and this is in our economic recovery team and outcome area, and on climate change, and very specifically on anticipatory cash. And so here, as you can see, and I won't read all the questions, but there are questions about feasibility, acceptability, effectiveness, not just on cash, but the size of the transfer in terms of its effectiveness, the cost efficiency and cost effectiveness of delivering cash prior to a climate shock, and whether that's more cost efficient or cost effectiveness than delivering it post shock, differences in impact by gender, and then questions on a broader question on scaling that's more of a learning question. So on that cost efficiency, and so these are questions that the teams have about that would help them make decisions that we think would help the field to make better decisions about climate related cash distribution, anticipatory cash. And then we use this to inform when there are opportunities that come up for impact evaluations or other research. So I thought I'd highlight the one on cost efficiency and cost effectiveness in a current study that is ongoing and actually has closed, but the analysis is still being done. And so this leads to, with that learning agenda, then looking out for opportunities and being flexible. What are the right methods to answer the priority questions? So we are right now, for that question on cost efficiency and cost effectiveness, doing an impact evaluation with google.org and IFPRI and the Center for Disaster Protection. So implementing a climate resiliency project in the northeastern state of Adamawa. And the pilot is using climate risk reduction ex ante, so cash payments before the flooding in this case, to smallholder farmers and livestock owners. And this was just completed in December of this year. The central hypothesis here is that when climate vulnerable communities have timely access to information and the financial and social resources to act upon that information, they will avoid negative coping strategies and build more diversified and climate resilient livelihoods. So the program's goal was really to reduce the negative coping strategies and support households. The research goal was to assess the effectiveness or the impact of a use of an early warning system and anticipatory cash to mitigate the level of shock and stress experienced by smallholder farmers in the event of a hazardous event. And the outcomes of interest were these negative coping strategies, improving food security and income, and to build resilience. And so here's what it looked like, and this is, I won't go into details of the methods, and this is at IRC, Claire Klingen leads this project together with the partners that I named. And so prior to the implementation, there was the team in Nigeria did data collection, analysis, looked at forecasting and modeling using prior meteorological and hydrological data to develop a readiness trigger and a trigger that would then lead to action, the action being the delivery of cash 14 days in advance. So that threshold was set. In fact, we unfortunately met that threshold and that trigger. And then within a few days, the team delivered cash to, you'll see, 725 households. So the flooding alert was given to the households, all of the households. And then the communities were randomized into two sets of communities, one that were getting the ex ante cash, the cash before the flooding, and then the other group, the comparison group, was getting ex post cash, so status quo, essentially what we usually do in humanitarian settings, which is following the flooding, then delivering cash to the households. So here the comparison, it was randomized. It's an impact evaluation looking at treatment difference, treatment A versus treatment B. There was no peer control, and here the emphasis was our question was not about is cash better than not receiving cash, but in fact, is receiving cash prior to the flood more helpful in terms of household outcomes and more cost effective and cost efficient for the humanitarian field than receiving it after the floods. So that data analysis is now ongoing. And in fact, many of IRC's impact evaluations have been either comparing treatments, or in many cases, a waitlist control or a rolling treatment where everyone ultimately receives whatever the treatment, whatever the program is, whatever the treatment is, but receives it in different tranches, and so then we can measure the outcome. It's rare that we have one where there is no, there's a peer control or an arm that doesn't receive any treatment. And so the third and final point I wanted to make is the point about really continuing to learn, do impact evaluations at the right time, really continue to learn, iterate, improve over time, and often before investing in an impact evaluation. Now, this isn't always the case. There are programs at scale that haven't been tested, and I think that's, those are really critical impact evaluations, but this is when we're designing or adopting a new intervention, and this is our, what looks much cleaner than it actually is, but our process of going from idea to prototype to pilot to rigorous evaluation to scale, and often doing multiple iterations within each stage. We have really tried to focus in more on what are we trying to learn at each stage and what's the level of certainty that we need at each stage. So I'm going to share something that is quite internal right now that helps guide each stage. Again, I won't go through each section of this, but it's really helping us to focus on iterating and learning and improving a lot more before impact evaluations, and doing numerous, doing it, having numerous metrics to do so. So in that idea stage, we're really identifying this and sizing the problem and opportunity, you can see here we're looking and making sure that, in fact, it's a significant problem to invest in, that the potential solution has the potential to significantly increase impact versus the status quo, or the scale per status quo, looking at whether we should in fact invest in this given our niche, and that there isn't a solution that exists currently that is good enough. As we're prototyping, we're then looking at developing a functional version of the solution, really focused on what are the clients' feedback that this is really a segment that's needed, and giving feedback that this is in fact something that is valued and wanted, that there's a market gap, that we're getting more certain about that gap. And then often we do multiple pilots. Those may or may not be, often are not, impact evaluations. They may be pre-post evaluations. Sometimes they are randomized or A/B testing. And so this is really when the solution is developed, trying to get multiple ways of learning to then change and improve the intervention before investing in the next phase of rigorous evaluation, and then further testing at scale. So let me stop there. I look forward to hearing from colleagues and to engaging in the discussion. I'll hand back to you, Chris.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jeannie. Incredibly rich stuff. If you've got questions for Jeannie and you don't want to forget them, do start putting them in the chat. But without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Marcella Vinieri from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And Marcella's promised to keep to around 8 minutes.
Thank you for having me today. My name, as was just announced, is Marcella Vinieri. I'm a research fellow at LSHTM. And I will be presenting today some highlights from a systematic review that is currently underway, trying to explore the effectiveness of economic development interventions in humanitarian settings in low and middle income countries. The co-authors on this piece of work are Suchi Malhotra, Nina de la Cruz, and Howard White, all from Campbell Collaboration. And obviously Howard has many other titles that I don't have time to go through. And I see that Suchi and Howard are here, so that's great. So we can sort of enrich the discussion as needed. In my 8 minutes, I will try to give some key points on issues around or where the idea of this review came from and its rationale, our approach of using a mid-level theory framework to set up the exercise, a very brief sort of understanding of what kind of outcome measures we've used to do our analysis, and some very preliminary findings as we are still in the process of revising our analysis that will then inform some pointers on future research needs. So why this review? As I'm sure you all know by now, CEDIL was set up to address, identify and address important gaps in evidence synthesis to inform more effective policy. And in particular, one of the things that the center has invested a lot is the approach to mid-level theory, which is particularly useful in the case of systematic reviews, as I will show in a minute, because it enables to transfer information across settings that share some commonalities in order to adapt and improve the design of programs. So we identified the existence of a substantial evidence gap on interventions that are trying to support economic opportunities for populations affected by humanitarian crisis. And I guess the two key points is that the review comes from a specific remit of the center to identify and address gaps in evidence synthesis, specifically in under-researched areas. The review also uses one of the approach that CEDIL has pushed importantly over the last 5 years, which is a mid-level theory approach to understand what is transferable, to adapt and design better programs. And lastly, for that very reason, we identified the existence of an important research gap in terms of which economic interventions may provide opportunities for populations affected by humanitarian crisis. And specifically, we decided to focus on those interventions that facilitate the transition from relief to sustainable development, and on programs where the potential of restoring economic independence, dignity, and self-reliance is the core of the program itself. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. So humanitarian settings, our approach in this review has been one to cover both natural disasters and situations or countries affected by political unrest and armed conflicts. The reason being, as just said, that in these settings, there seems to be a very specific need for new economic opportunities that can facilitate restoration of livelihoods and creation of integrated communities. Specifically, when thinking about these needs, we have been looking at interventions that develop new skills, training, opportunities that lead to self-reliance, and the development of livelihoods that can actually sustain the growth, the economic growth of both host and refugee populations in the aftermath of a crisis. Next slide, please. So mid-level theory approach, without going into many details, of course, as I said, the big pluses of this approach is that in the specific case of this review, it helps to extrapolate information across settings which are different. So we are looking at both population affected by conflict and population affected by natural disasters, but populations that have clearly share some commonalities in terms of the barriers and their needs. And therefore, what the MLT does is that it allows to identify causal pathways to impact that are then transferable to other similar settings and perhaps can help to design better policies and programs. So if we just go to the next slide, please. This, of course, is a very busy slide, but I just wanted to show here what we have in stock when the publication comes out. And the one thing that I really wanted to focus on is this issue about looking on the left-hand side at programs that fall into three broad categories. So livelihood programs, market support programs, and local area development programs, because these, there's a wide range of programs that can actually get to the final impact that we're interested in, which is sustainable economic development. And throughout, we have mapped out here what are the range of activities that can lead to outputs and outcomes that are shared by the populations that we've looked at in the systematic review. So not just creation of market opportunities, but also new employment opportunities, as well as empowerment of women and sustainability of people affected by psychosocial and health issues as a result of the crisis they've been exposed to, and how they can be supported for new opportunities. An important piece of the mid-level theory approach, if we can just move to the next slide, please, is that it actually relies on a number of assumptions. And by assumptions, we mean actually hypotheses, if you will, or priors that we think have to be in place in order for those interventions to actually get into the causal pathway to impact. And of course, these assumptions are what the exercise in the systematic review is about. So to see whether these assumptions have been considered, accounted in the literature that exists for these interventions, and whether they actually did deliver what they were meant to deliver. So just as an example, one of these assumptions is that the programs that need to be put in place to facilitate economic development need to ensure that the content, for example, of training, of employment training programs is accessible and context appropriate for the receiving populations. Another assumption is super important is that market knowledge needs to be there, and it has to be organized in a way which is timely sensitive so that it can actually facilitate the sale of new products. And finally, as we just discussed in the previous slide, we need programs that actually can facilitate an improvement or overcoming of physical and mental health post-disastrous conditions, so that people can get back going in terms of their livelihoods and economic opportunities. So in the next slide, please. Yep, thanks. Here I've just sort of jotted down some of the outcome categories in the table on the left-hand side that we're looking at and that were comprehensively included in our search, and some of the examples of what those categories are effectively and how they were measured. The other feature, which we think is kind of unique and innovative about the systematic review, is that it embeds a number of study designs, precisely because we wanted to really be as comprehensive as possible in trying to understand what the state of the evidence is. So we've got process evaluations and qualitative studies, of course, effectiveness evaluations, which cover both RCTs and quasi-experimental studies, and also mixed method studies were included. So the next slides, which shows very briefly our Prisma chart, if you scroll all the way down visually, it will show you the number of studies that we ended up with. So we've got 2 mixed review studies, 16 effectiveness studies, and 15 process evaluations. Going into the next slide. So as I said, we are still in the process of revising our analysis, but what is coming out of our analysis quite prominently is that the overall effect size of economic interventions on the economic categories outcomes that I just showed is positive and significant. So that means that some of these interventions are working. And obviously, because we have collated a number of studies that are looking at different populations and that are looking at different programs, it is important to unpack the box and try to understand which ones are more effective on what. So that's what we are in the process of doing. And another result that is coming out quite prominently is that livelihood programs seem to be the ones with the largest positive effect. And on the other end, instead, the overall effect size of social outcomes seems to be small so far and not statistically significant. The other piece of analysis that we've done, thank you, is a moderator analysis. And again, the table here is just sort of to give you a flavor of what we're working on, where we're trying to see getting the average effect size that we've sort of extracted from the meta-analysis, what are which ones are the variables that are sort of having the most sort of important effect on this size effect of these programs. And as you can see here, it seems that the one that has the largest effect is the type of setting, humanitarian setting, that is considered. So what this result suggests is that populations afflicted by conflict seem to be the ones that benefit the most from programs that are aiming to improve their economic outlook and their sustainable economic output. So I guess this brings me to I think it's my either last or penultimate slide. I think it's the last one. This is very much work in progress still, but we are sort of confident that, we are kind of opening up the research sort of path through to a place where, mixed methods become actually a priority also in terms of running systematic reviews, so that you can be as comprehensive as possible when you actually look at the body of literature that exists on things that are clearly under research, as we also heard earlier from Janine. The other feature about the systematic review is that it is trying to combine a number of things that CEDIL has invested a lot on. And one of these, of course, is being to look at the mid-level theory approach to understand sort of causal pathways that are relevant for common needs across populations afflicted by humanitarian crisis. And the other sort of result that is emerging quite clearly is that the literature has quite a sort of substantial gap still in terms of understanding the impact that these interventions have host populations, with a few noticeable exceptions, one being the SHARP project that Alan is going to be talking about shortly, and also the Seeds Recovery Program that Ghassan is also going to be talking shortly. So, you know, there is movement in terms of being more comprehensive about the impact of these interventions, not just for those directly affected by humanitarian crisis, but also those that have to sort of cope with changes to their economies and their livelihoods that happen as a result of that. And I guess my last remark is really a question, an open question as to where do we go from here. And I guess that the results of this systematic review provide an important starting point to see what the direction of travel should be. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Lots there, and there's certainly one question for you in the chat if you have time to look at that while you're listening to our next speaker, Ghassan Baliki, who is the director of the Welfare Research Program at the International Security and Development Center. So over to you, Ghassan, for your 8 minutes.
Thank you. Do you see my slides?
Yes. Yeah.
The full screen, right?
It's in the notes.
Yes. Already.
No, it's on the notes.
Displays then. Now it's better.
That's better. That's perfect.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. So today I'm just going to quickly summarize findings from our Seeds for Recovery project, which was an impact evaluation on multiple agricultural interventions that we conducted in Syria over the past 3 years, and which was funded by CEDIL and the UK aid. This work kind of summarizes lots of findings from multiple papers we have worked on from my team at ISTC, including Tilman Brook, Aisha Brook, Uglu, Dorothée Weifen, as well as our colleagues from the American University of Beirut, including Hala Ghattas, Hadi Jafar, Marid Dakash, and Lara Sujud. So as has been mentioned by Jeannie and Marcella and Chris as well, that we know that violent conflict is driving most of the humanitarian needs recently, and it's very well linked to the food insecurity. The worsening food insecurity is taking place. It's been estimated that by the end of this decade, that most of the poorest people will be living in fragile and conflict-affected settings, raising the need for more humanitarian aid and demand. On the other hand, we also know that there's multiple rigorous impact evaluation, as Gina has shown, in peaceful settings that show that agricultural intervention, nutrition-sensitive agricultural interventions do improve production and consumption of healthy food groups, as well as the nutrition status for children and women, as well as has social implications on women empowerment. But the question remains, do these impacts can also be observed in conflict-affected and humanitarian settings? But generally, we know that there's lots of weak insights, apart from the multiple of studies that recently have been catching on doing more rigorous impact evaluations on how best we can support people in need to improve their welfare and food security specifically, not just in the short term, but what else the long-term and sustainable long-term impact effects of such programs, emergency programs, can have in the longer term. And it boils down to the issue of that how we can best generate rigorous evidence given all the ethical and practical challenges. So in this project, we tried to kind of touch upon these kind of questions and answers. So we had both an empirical objectives to improve our understanding of the short and long-term impacts of agricultural interventions in humanitarian and protracted crisis settings, as well as a methodological objective is to see how we can adapt existing approaches in evaluations, as well as novel methods in order to improve our learning and our rigor in these studies. So, and we ended up working in Syria with the FAO implemented intervention, which was also funded by the FCDO. It's a large-scale agricultural intervention, which took place around 3 years in multiple phases. It mainly targeted youth and female-headed households. So it had more kind of an emergency type of support, but as well as recovery and types of intervention, including like rehabilitation of irrigation systems. So we see this kind of different types of combination of both emergency needs, meeting the emergency needs of smallholder farmers, but as well as looking forward beyond the crisis settings of how we can support people beyond the emergency phase. And I just want to pinpoint that context really matters in Syria, and this is something we want to really bring into focus here. That here we see that, for example, this is the SPEI index showing the drought in Syria, and we see before our intervention, which are the lines here of the data collection that we did, that Syria it's below zero is loss of drought, that has been witnessing a huge drought episode that has changed and fluctuated during our study period. Here we look into ACLED, the conflict event. We see that the number of violent events has been decreasing in all shapes and forms in Syria in the past 3-4 years. So you want to take that into account, into understanding how these different types of contextual factors play a role. But here also Syria, since the reduction of the violence conflict, we see a sharp increase in the hyperinflation. And here, for example, the ratio of the USD to the Syrian pounds has been increasing, and people have been facing lots of challenges. So bringing all these kind of crises all together, one has to kind of understand how we can maximize the learning and evidence. And so what we came to is we mainly did a quasi-experimental approach, looking both at the treatment and the control group. However, we made it a little bit adaptable because we had some challenges early on identifying households, and we given that the phase-in design, so a different way. So we collected 4 waves in total across the whole study. We added additional samples of treatment groups in order to compensate for the sample loss and attrition that we faced. So this kind of shows one of the many challenges that we face as researchers working in such settings. These things change on the ground. There's different factors that cannot, 3 years ago, how things were planned, and that might take into account. So that's something to keep in mind. As well as we did lots of methods and techniques, including balancing techniques such as propensity score matching and entropy balancing. We used multivariate panel analysis to look into average treatment effects into the short and long term, and machine learning techniques and deep learning techniques to look into heterogeneity impact, as well as we try to experiment a little bit with looking into if we can measure impact using satellite data, particularly for the irrigation rehabilitation. So combine both different types of data to see if we can find impact through there and learning. And so just quickly through the findings. So good news and quite as expected. So we see that there's a significant positive impact of receiving particularly vegetable support and irrigation kits in the short term, as well as we see that this kind of effect has sustained in the long term. So we see around 9% push points on the food consumption score, which translate to around 18% increase from baseline values. So this is a good and positive increase. And the good news is that we don't see it just sharply happening after receiving support, but the difference that we observed between the control and the treatment actually sustained after even 3 years after we interviewed those households. Also, quite a little bit more surprisingly, that we look into the RCSI as a kind of a measure of looking at into the resilience of households if they had to adopt any harmful coping strategies to deal with food shortages or shortage of money. And here we don't find any strong impacts in the short term. However, the larger here, so we see the control group here with the dotted line, the higher the value, the worse people off. So we see that the gap is actually increasing between the control and treatment, showing that even 3 years onwards, households who received support do not have to adapt a very harmful coping strategy, regardless of all the contextual things that I have mentioned. So we see very good improvements on that end, which shows that emergency support can also have longer term resilience impacts. As well as we look into other types of more socioeconomic types of outcomes, and we find that also households in the long term who have received support send their children less to work, as well as we find less child marriage as a result of people having to deal with food shortages and shortage of money, which shows that such kind of programs, although have emergency type in nature, also can have other types of implications on another aspect of people's lives and livelihoods. Then next we look into, as I mentioned, the heterogeneity impact, because we want to really understand who really actually benefits from these programs. So we go ahead and we conduct the here machine learning techniques, especially the honest causal forest, and this way it let us kind of estimate the conditional average treatment impact based on if households were female-headed or male-headed, as well as different classification of degrees of exposure of violence conflict in 1 year before each interview took place. And here we show the results. So here we're looking at the scale between 0 and 8 of what's the impact, what I showed you earlier on the food security, and we see that households who are headed by females who experience moderate levels of conflict, which goes into this group, have actually benefited most from the program. While we see male-headed households who were exposed to extreme levels of violent conflict or been living in peaceful settings did not benefit much from the program, which shows that such types of emergency support like agricultural tools might not be enough in terms of extreme high local violence. Maybe food aid or cash might be a better types of support, and this has been tested in other settings and shown that it is the case. And maybe in low or more peaceful settings where things are becoming a little bit more operation and business as usual, especially to farmers, such type of small support might not be enough. So we see that the control group is actually catching up by doing other types of work. So maybe we need more thinking of how we can have start the transitioning, at which type of levels of violence we need to start transitioning to have stronger impacts at different levels. And just a bit quickly looking into measuring the impacts with the satellite imagery. So here we also try to do a quasi-experimental design by taking villages in Deir ez-Zor here around the river of Deir ez-Zor, which is one of the main source of water in a very arid and desert-like area. And we have selected control treatments where we know that the treatment villages have received irrigation rehabilitations as well as control villages. And we took satellite imagery and we tried to estimate the NDVI here, which is kind of the vegetation index, to see if there's any positive impacts of the program. And as you see here, this is the river in red, and see that before the war, things were all well and green. As the start of the war, we see less activity in the production. And in 2018, we see that after the end of inside the war, 5 years into the war, we see that there's no production at all. And after irrigation, we could differentiate using machine learning what actually is driven by water, by rainfall, and what's actually driven by irrigation, that we see there's a positive impact to a certain extent to the households who were farmers growing the vegetables in Deir ez-Zor. So just to summarize kind of the lessons learned of all the multiple studies we have done under CEDS, is that it's really important to look into longer term project horizon, even in emergency settings. So we want to, because sometimes we need to start designing and thinking of how types of emergency support, of combination of emergency interventions can have longer term impacts, particularly in terms of building resilience and other types of socioeconomic impacts that has not been kind of planned or theorized early on. So this is important to look at longer time horizons. It's important also within transitioning into a more peaceful and less protracted, less humanitarian kind of emergency, to strengthen rural markets in order to improve also the impacts and kind of have multipliers. It's also key to cluster interventions, as in other papers we have also shown that one intervention alone might not be enough or sufficient in order to improve impact. And as well as kind of reduce the complexity in such nature, especially in a place like Syria, to design kind of a clear program and interventions that have specific outcomes that can be really actually measured and followed up on, rather than including them into one big bundles of programs that we cannot really differentiate what really works and what doesn't work. And of course, and I think this is something goes back to maybe our discussion, is that we need better learning tools in order to improve our impact evaluation learning in such humanitarian settings. Thank you very much, and I'm back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Hassan. That's so impressive what you and your teams have managed to do there. It's amazing. Right, let's now go to Alan DeBarrel from IFPRI.
Hello, thank you. I'm going to share my screen quickly, and I'm going to apologize for the barking dog. She was quiet until just a minute ago, and will calm down, I'm sure, in a minute. So I'm going to talk about studying the SHARP program in Ethiopia. I'm really lucky that 2 of the speakers so far have, but before I start, I was going to apologize for not really being an expert on humanitarian impact evaluation. And then 2 of the speakers prior to me have highlighted some of the work I'm involved with. I'm lightly involved in the IRC IFPRI anticipatory cash transfer evaluation. I can tell you there are some interesting results, and we'll have them out next month. I think we have an event scheduled in Nigeria for March 21st because we had to wait for the election. We're anticipating election, not necessarily anything bad from the election that's coming this weekend, but we wanted to make sure that we avoided the period of both federal and local elections that are coming up. I'm going to talk a little bit. The SHARP program is a little bit different, and I think that's what I think is very interesting about it. And really it's a bit different because we're talking more about protracted crises in this case. This is a question that IFPRI's been interested in for a little while, in understanding how to integrate refugees within host populations who are not, kind of clearly not going home anytime soon, home to their home country, and how to integrate them into local markets and into the local economy. The SHARP program, which stands for Strengthening Host and Refugee Populations in Ethiopia, worked through a market systems approach, which is well known in agriculture, but and agricultural interventions among practitioners, but not so much outside of agriculture. So quickly, the idea behind a market systems approach is to work with market actors to put innovations that help put in place innovations that help develop the market rather than directly intervening. And the idea is that these changes become more sustainable once the project leaves. So an important thing to do here is to identify constraints to the market working for both consumers and the producers, if you will. And so the SHARP innovation is to take this idea, this thinking to a refugee hosting area, rather than working on an agricultural intervention. So this is a place where the markets may even be more underdeveloped, so to speak. A catch here is that there's very little impact evaluation that's been done on market systems development projects, even less than what Jeannie described for humanitarian interventions. So we're looking at an almost empty Venn diagram, or a certainly empty Venn diagram here. So thinking quickly about the goal, what we did is we looked at one of the market systems that SHARP was intervening in, which is the financial market system. We were hoping to look at more, but the budget issues that Chris suggested early on affected what we could do. And in general, we wanted one of their goals was to increase financial access in general. So we can, even if we define financial access quite broadly to include just having a mobile money account, pre-SHARP, it was really low. And the best data I can cite would say that, I think it's 2% of Somali region had access to a financial account. And that's all adults in Somali region of Ethiopia. While most countries in sub-Saharan Africa, this is in 2017, most countries in sub-Saharan Africa are closer to 50% now in financial access. So even if you include the mobile money, there's no way that I can state very confidently, there's no way they were close to 50%. So question we were asking here is what steps are necessary to build up the financial market system in refugee hosting areas? And one of the things we've noted in doing this evaluation is that when you have a new product that's available that is going to be adapted quickly by the population, and that's the case with mobile money in this area. What happens is something will happen, but that may not align with social goals. And specifically here, we want to see women and refugees using this new innovation. So that's where we can see the need for intervention. So we're applying this theory by looking really at mobile money. Luckily, this is coinciding with a massive, actually, relaxation in regulations in Ethiopia around mobile phone ownership and entry into this market. In Somali region, SHARP ended up collaborating with Somali MFI, which then has become a bank. So they're now known as Shebele Bank, and they promote a product called Hello Cash. And so we've worked very closely with both the SHARP project and with Shebele Bank to work on increasing adoption in areas surrounding refugee camps. So they were already essentially working on Hello Cash, but they were working on it really where they saw the profit opportunities in areas, in Jijiga City and other areas that are quite well populated, but not in these areas near refugee camps. And we don't want. And another social goal here is to not leave women and refugees left behind. Okay. So our evaluation approach was a general mixed method evaluation of the SHARP investments in the market system. And then we co-identified constraints, or collaboratively identified constraints to meeting those social goals, and we ran what we were hoping would be rapid RCTs to try to learn about them. Had we had more time in the evaluation, we would have adapted those RCTs and run multiple versions. But due to COVID and conflict in Ethiopia, ironically, we ended up running out of time to do that. And so the RCTs ended up being meant to increase enrollment and use. So we had kind of two different RCTs, one focusing on increasing enrollment among targeted groups and one on use. So top line results, I'm going to be really brief here, is that they clearly developed the market near the refugee camps in Jijiga area. There's a large agent density for mobile money, even building into refugee camps, which I think was really complicated. I don't think it was really complicated. They have a large number of customers and the system use is clearly growing. They also worked in the Doloado area, which is in the south of really along the Kenya border with Somalia and Ethiopia. I mean, really along the Kenya border. There, it's been more challenging, but you see some signs of growth, and we do see that they had more trouble getting women and refugee customers. So just quickly, we ran a referral system, and we randomized the bonuses that would be paid to people for this referral system. The referral system really ran for 3 months. In the middle here, you can see that the enrollment grew dramatically through the referral system, almost 50%. We weren't able to enroll more women or refugees, but we did substantially change the place where the enrollment took place from Jijiga to Doloado. So you can see they were about half and half through standard enrollment in September, and 85% of the enrollees were in Doloado in September of 2022. Ironically, a lot of that is one person. I can get into that in Q&A. The incentive experiment, we used unconditional, really small kind of bonus promotion things that actually a business like Jebele Bank would do, but we randomized it. And we gave one group unconditional transfers and one conditional transfers. The conditional transfers actually only worked among women. We didn't really find much, we didn't find any impacts on refugees using the system. So I'm going to leave it there because I'm about out of time. And I know we're running out of time for Q&A. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Alan, thank you so much. Look, that's a brilliant set of presentations covering, detailed work, systematic reviews, but also an organizational perspective. So we'll open up for questions now. I'm just going to start with one question, well, actually an offer that I've received. And I'm going to bring in, hopefully, Jess Camburn from ELRA, who are running a global prioritization exercise that I think will be of interest and relevance to all. So Jess, hopefully we'll be able to bring you in. Over to you. Yeah, we can hear you. Oh, you've gone. Let's give it one more go, and then we'll see if there's a... Well, while we're waiting for Jess, Tilman, you've raised a really interesting question there around, well, a comment around diversity of context. I don't know if any of our presenters would like to just reflect on that, and then we'll come to you straight after Jess. So just discussing the huge range of context where we're doing this work and how we draw broader evidence of what works from that. So I don't know if anybody would like to come in on that from the panel. Alan, you look like you're tempted.
I can always talk, but I would say that, look, that provides a real need for people like Jess to do prioritization exercises, and for the types of Jeannie had a really nice presentation of like a learning agenda. So we need learning agendas and prioritization to be able to figure out how to attack the questions like that.
Perfect. So hopefully that's a nice entry point to, are you there now?
I think I'm here. Am I here, Chris?
Perfect. Yes, you are. Go for it. Perfect.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for giving me the first question. That's very kind of you, Chris. And thanks, really inspiring set of presentations and fascinating. So I want to spend a bit more time reading up on what I've just been watching. But yeah, just to, I guess, talk about the GPE, the prioritization process that we're going through. I'm hoping a lot of you are aware of it. Kind of ELRA's position is that we believe there needs to be much more strategic kind of targeting and use of research and innovation capabilities across the humanitarian sector. So we all know we're sort of struggling with these issues of need for reform, and how does reform happen, and how does change, and how do we find solutions to these bigger humanitarian challenges, given the kind of escalating needs that we're seeing. And we fundamentally believe that research and innovation needs to be part of that transformative journey, that it must be an ally of the humanitarian system to bring about change. But at the moment, what we're seeing is a lot of fragmented investments. So lots of small scale investments in diversity of issues across the sector. While that's great, and it's great to see growth, we're seeing a lot of growth in research and innovation investments. We're sort of missing, we believe that we're missing the potential for our collective efforts to really be transformative. And so one piece we're doing, we're supported by the Netherlands and UK governments to do this research, is to consult globally at multiple levels. So at the global system level, at key regional levels across the world, and then at community level, to try and work out how is the system performing right now for research and innovation, how are we working to invest in research and innovation, and what are the challenges, but also what are the priorities that people working in the front line of humanitarian practice, communities affected by crisis themselves, and those working at the system level, where are the priorities that we should be investing to, so we can really begin to accelerate change through the way that we use research and innovation. And that piece of work will be hopefully published for the second half of this year, including kind of regional, national sets of priorities in time that we hope will then help those who fund and invest in research and innovation to invest wisely and strategically. But I was really fascinated by the presentations around impact as well, because one of the big challenges we've identified through the research is the fact that there isn't a standard approach yet to measure the impact of research and innovation investments. And that's a problem for us, because we need to, as a research and innovation community, we need to make the case that an investment in research and innovation is worth it, that it delivers results that can be kind of quantified and demonstrated. And at the moment, we haven't made that case very well as a community. And I think those who have really limited resources, if they're not convinced that it's worth giving those resources to research and innovation when they have such high operational needs. And so it's incumbent on us as this community to find ways that we can better demonstrate the impact that an investment will make and the changes it will give. So it's great to see some of these presentations and actually getting some of that compelling data. And one of the pieces of work we've been doing actually with IRC, and if you're always just looking at is there a combined, almost like a minimum set or approach of measurements that we can use as a model of people like ourselves, ELRA, who invest in research and innovation, or people like the donors who invest in it as well? What can we use that is common, that begins to make a more compelling picture, not only of individual investments, but also as kind of portfolio investments? So if we invest X percentage in a particular sector, in a particular area, what are we measuring to demonstrate the impact, and can we get consistency across that? So I'd love to discuss whether people feel that's possible, of value, or anything about the GP. Very happy to take this question, but I don't want to dominate, Chris. I know you've got lots of things to discuss, but thanks for the space.
Brilliant, thanks, Jess. And maybe if you're able to, maybe you could just put the link to
Sure.
the GPE in the chat so that people could see that. Would any of the panel like to come back on that and issues raised by Jess there? Jeannie, I can't see you, but maybe you want to.
Sure, I can just say, I think the question of investment in showing the importance of research and innovation and what investment brings about is really critical. And I'm glad you mentioned at a portfolio level, because I think it's very hard to make the case that one individual study or one individual investment in innovation, the idea is that there's going to be a lot of trial and error. Some things, in fact, are going to have null results or not have impact. And so thinking about a portfolio level, which is part of what I presented there at the end, and we think about even a loss ratio, where do we think we're going to invest and likely not have impact, and where like an impact investment. And so we're trialing out this new framework and have worked a little bit with ELRA, as just mentioned. And so we'll have more to say on this, but happy to share early thinking. But I do think it's really critical for us to be trying to measure what these investments bring about in terms of change within the humanitarian sector and improvements in people's lives ultimately.
Thanks, Jeannie. Marcella, Ghassan, would you like to come in on this at all? No? Okay. Oh, Marcella, go ahead.
Just one quick note to say that the issue of standard approaches and measurements that can be replicated across the board is obviously super important from a policy point of view, but also it's the huge challenge from an empirical point of view. And by that, I mean, when you think about measures to cut across and that actually capture accurately what you're trying to measure, this goes back to the point raised by Tillman in his question. You have to actually think about how do you manage the trade-off between things that are very context specific and things that actually are somehow common. And I think that is what CEDIL has been doing over the last 5 years and invested a lot of resources on. It's not an easy path, but I think a lot of progress has been made. And part of the progress is also engaging much more with those that are actually receiving or should be receiving the services from the evidence that is coming. Because what I find myself many times in a situation where I go to a country and I say, look, I've done this piece of work, this is what the evidence says. And they say, yeah, but why didn't you account for X, Y, Z? So maybe one approach could be to sort of, I'm sure it's been said many, many times, to actually start thinking about measures of commonality, standard approaches after collating the evidence of what is actually needed, what do we actually need to measure, and that should come from the ground rather than maybe from the books or from theory.
Thanks, Marcella. Ghassan, would you like to come in at all?
Yes, thank you, Chris. No, I'd just like to add, I think one important issue that we need to kind of bring as a community is kind of the external validity of the results, particularly in the humanitarian settings. It goes back to Tillman. Yes, we know there's all these comments about the variability and the volatility in different settings, and it's really hard to put one kind of red thread through all these topics and say, okay, this is one learning lesson that we can adopt. But I think innovating in a way how we can leverage existing data and methods and speed and all these things that we can do analytically in order to actually start external validating, not just in humanitarian setting, but generally in impact evaluations, so we can maximize kind of the investment in research and innovations that can be kind of applied and adapted in different settings. So I think this is something that might be the next step into formalizing it more in a research setting.
Great, thank you. A good challenge from Cordelia around uptake and how our panelists are trying to max uptake. I guess there's also a role there for people like me as well to help with that, but it'd be interesting to hear reflections from the panel on uptake and actually making this impact evaluations get used. Anyone wants to come in?
So I can say that. So no, for us, we had the great opportunity to working with the FAO Syria, the team on this evaluation. It has been kind of a really collaboration, co-creation, if I may. And I think this is kind of key for as researchers, we kind of embed our design and our thinking with the team on the ground and with the implementers. And I think because one of the questions you ask, become a little bit more relevant. Sometimes we as researchers want to find the solution, but sometimes it's really a practical small solution that can be adapted in programming. And in terms of uptake, at least we saw it vis-a-vis FCDO and the FAO Syria. We have kind of the lessons that we took have been implemented in other programming. And as I said, so that's kind of self-contained. Yes, we understand the setting very well, but I think how we can really do this uptake to other settings and other things. And this is something that's still kind of a gap that needs to be filled from both sides.
Anybody else like to come in on that? Jeannie, from your side at all?
Sure, I can build on Ghassan's co-creation point. I think that's been really critical for whoever is implementing and the researchers to really co-create what the design is and the research and be involved and then that helps. It doesn't necessarily guarantee uptake. There are so many constraints, as we know, and donors, Chris, as you said, donors play a really big part. If there isn't funding for the uptake, of the follow-on programs, and it's really hard for implementing agencies to then take that up. And then it does relate, I think, to a question from Claire Allen about systematic reviews that are then, because you want to be a little bit careful on one impact evaluation, even though in a particular setting, but also how does that relate to the broader literature, and how can we get to as concrete as possible recommendations, considering different conditions, and really help very constrained policymakers, practitioners to have the recommendations they need to be able to make decisions. How do we help donors then really support those evidence-based decisions with reviews of evidence and recommendations that don't overstretch, but are also more concrete than often reviews are. But I want to fully endorse the co-creation point. I think it's really critical.
Great, thank you. I've had a question that's come in through another direction, somebody who was struggling with the Q&A. And this is a real tough one. If we recognize that most of our work is in conflict settings, any top tips from the panel, and maybe Ghassan, this speaks especially to you from your Syria work, on how to do this in places where your contact with affected communities may be very limited, your chance to go in and co-design and involve may be quite limited. Any top tips so that we avoid just doing this in easy places?
Happy to take this one. Yes, definitely. This is the biggest challenge. And I think this is kind of, was one of, it goes back, yeah, because of course the organizations that work in such settings have access. Yeah, they work with focal groups in different areas, even in very high intensity conflict settings, yeah, to get the aid. And I think, you know, it's like learning, building on those kind of channels. And I think as a researcher, one has to kind of see how much they can be involved on the ground. And of course, you cannot guarantee the best quality data. And I'm not sure if you always, especially in the humanitarian settings, people's response might be biased because of the needs. And of course, all these things, the challenges that come with it. But of course, the more that we try to approach that in an open mind and then work together with the team that's actually delivering the aid, one that as researchers come together and then build a study and learning around that. I think this is kind of the key to solving such an issue.
Great. Well, look, we're nearly out of time, so I'm going to just try and sum up very briefly. First of all, by just saying a huge thanks to our panelists. Really inspiring to hear of your work. Makes me want to go and read more. I'd heard some of it before, some of it is new, and it's certainly made me want to go and dig out a bit more. So thank you for making the time today and sharing those insights. I think also some positive news. I'd like, Jeannie, your take. There's some really good stuff happening, and we've moved on from a few years ago, and so that's to be celebrated. But my goodness, so much more to do, and so much more to do in very, very tricky places. And so, Ghassan, your last points there are really key. I just draw us back again to I guess everybody's reflected that in a situation of limited resources, prioritizing and getting together, where do we need to focus this down? Speaking to Tillman's points on making sure that we're really getting the evidence from where we need it, where it's relevant, where it's context specific. So the prioritization exercise that Elra is trying to help us all with is really, really important. So great if people can engage with that, and such fantastic expertise and capability on this call from the panelists, but also other participants. Great if people could be involved in that. But thank you very much for today, and huge thanks to CEDIL for setting this up and for letting me learn from it as well. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good rest of the day.